If you look at Japan from the outside, it seems like a country with advanced robotic technology, a fascinating culture, almost non-existent crime rates, the third largest global economy, a healthy population, and world-renowned companies. In many ways, it seems like an ideal place. However, when you take a closer look, you realize that despite these wonders, there's a much darker side to life in Japan that most people don't know about. Japan is home to millions of individuals who couldn't find their place in society and ended up completely isolated. They don't have access to jobs, can't get married, and can't live a normal, happy life. These individuals are known as the lost generation, making up about 15% of Japan's population. Their sad journey reflects Japan's decline and serves as a worrying sign for its future. This is the dark side of Japan, the lost generation. In the 1980s, although nearly forgotten now, Japan was seen as the next economic superpower, expected to surpass the United States and dominate the global economy, similar to what we see with China today. The expectation that this would happen was so strong, it caused serious anxiety in the United States, with articles warning about a Japanese economic Pearl Harbor. At that time, there was a concern that Japan was buying up the United States, reflected in movies like Die Hard, Rising Sun, and Blade Runner, which portrayed Japanese corporations taking over America and the world. This worry came from the so-called Japanese miracle, a period of 3 decades of continuous and significant economic growth, made possible by a unique Japanese economic system that was then seen as superior to the Western model. Japan's economic system in the 1980s was based on close cooperation between large corporate conglomerates and the Japanese government. These conglomerates, known as keiretsu, were alliances formed by the country's biggest companies, which owned shares in each other and supported one another. The Japanese government, through the state-owned National Bank of Japan, gave generous loans to these conglomerates, allowing them to access vast amounts of money to finance their international expansion. This led to a situation where Japanese business alliances had almost unlimited resources to grow, while the government kept foreign companies out of the domestic market. Even though this system wasn't exactly fair or healthy, it worked well. The Japanese stock market was booming, and Japanese products were gaining ground in global markets. For many, the path seemed clear: get a college degree, land a job at a big corporation, and enjoy lifetime job stability. Japan seemed unbeatable, and everything was going according to plan until an unexpected event changed everything. By 1991, Japan had experienced 3 decades of rapid economic growth, becoming the second largest economy in the world, just behind the United States. With the economy expanding, real estate prices and the value of companies listed on the stock market skyrocketed. But by the late 1980s, this excessive growth turned into a speculative bubble. There was a widespread belief that the economic boom and asset appreciation would continue indefinitely, encouraging reckless investments. At the same time, the National Bank of Japan kept printing money and giving out loans carelessly, without considering the purpose of the funds or the reliability of the borrowers. Eventually, the bubble burst. In 1990, the stock market plummeted by 43%, and real estate prices followed the same trend. The collapse of the bubble led to a drastic reduction in the purchasing power of ordinary people, marking the start of a long period of economic hardship for the country. When the economic bubble burst, investors lost interest in Japanese companies, marking the end of the prosperity period. Additionally, the collapse revealed widespread corruption in Japanese business and government, including insider trading, stock manipulation, fraud, and bribery. This crisis also led to the emergence of hundreds of zombie companies, businesses that should have gone under, but kept operating thanks to the steady flow of cheap government-borrowed money. In a decade, Japan went from an economic powerhouse, often dubbed the Asian tiger, to being known as the sick man of Asia. While this drastic shift was significant, it wasn't a one-off event, as economic fluctuations are common in many countries. However, the impact on Japan was unique. Unlike elsewhere, the Japanese recession had devastating consequences for an entire generation, with millions of people never managing to bounce back. To understand why, it's essential to grasp the culture of work and hiring in Japan, which is pretty intense and has unique characteristics. In Japan, the corporate career often starts with shushoku katsudo, a specific job hunting ritual that university graduates go through upon completing their studies. Many companies, including the largest keiretsu, only hire fresh graduates and do so just once a year, admitting a large number of people simultaneously. Once inside the company, there's a policy known as Sannensei Sokitei-sei, which grooms employees throughout their careers to eventually become executives. These practices, widely adopted in the 90s, are still common in Japan, and while they provide stability, they also create an extremely rigid job market. It means that to land a good job, young people have only one shot right after university. Once hired in a Japanese company, you're expected to stay there for your entire career. However, if you don't snag a job right after university, you're shut out of the job market, and most companies' doors will permanently close to you. When the economic bubble burst and the prosperity period ended, this rigid system was shattered. During the boom, it was relatively easy to at least land some corporate job, but after the 90s, most companies completely halted their hiring for almost the entire decade, trying to keep their employees on board during the economic crisis. When hiring resumed in the new millennium, getting a job became much tougher. For those who graduated in the 90s, the ship had already sailed. These grads weren't seen as fresh graduates anymore, and companies preferred hiring new grads instead. So, an entire generation, unfortunate enough to graduate at the wrong time, was left behind. Millions found themselves stuck in temporary, part-time, and poorly paid jobs. This period is known as the Employment Ice Age, and the grads from this era are dubbed the Lost Generation. Since the Japanese economy never fully bounced back, many young people who graduated in the 2000s and 2010s also faced hardships, making the last 3 decades known as the Lost Decades. It's tragic for the members of the Lost Generation, but its impact goes beyond them. The entire Japanese society suffers from it, and Japan's future looks grim. There's a whole generation of people in their 30s to 40s completely out of the job market. Many live with their parents and depend on them financially. They never got the financial stability to start their own families or build proper careers. About 15% of the population, roughly 17 million people, are part of the Lost Generation, which is particularly serious because these folks are in the prime working age of 30 to 40, the most crucial for any country's economy. They're the ones who typically spend more on families, homes, mortgages, and cars, driving the economy. In Japan, however, this group is missing, and the economy suffers for it. Moreover, the Lost Generation exacerbates another major issue in the country: superaging. Japan has the highest proportion of elderly in the world, with nearly 30% of the population over 65, and it's aging faster than any other country. This is partly due to the millions of children the Lost Generation never had. By 2050, the ratio of elderly to working age people will be 1 to 1.3, almost one elderly person for every person aged 15 to 64. Everywhere, seniors rely on taxes paid by workers. But in Japan, this will become unsustainable. In addition to economic and demographic challenges, the Lost Generation has contributed to a growing social problem, the Hikikomori phenomenon. These are young adults who choose to completely isolate themselves, living as shut-ins with no social contact, financially dependent on their parents. The first Hikikomori were members of the Lost Generation, now men in their 40s, who couldn't meet the societal expectations of getting a job, advancing in their careers, starting a family, and supporting themselves. In response, they opted out of participating in society's life. This voluntary isolation is a reaction to intense pressure and failures in the economic and social system, creating a vicious cycle that further affects Japan's economy and social fabric. The combination of a shrinking workforce and aging population and the increasing Hikikomori phenomenon puts Japan in an increasingly precarious situation with deep challenges to solve in the coming years. Over time, young people from more recent generations have also started joining the Hikikomori. Despite having opportunities to enter the workforce, many found it overly stressful and competitive. Currently, there are nearly 1 million people in Japan affected by this social phenomenon, which is becoming a serious problem for society. The Japanese government acknowledges the extremely negative impacts of the lost generation and the growing number of Hikikomori on society and the economy. The government has announced plans to help the lost generation recover and reintegrate Hikikomori into society. However, so far these efforts have seen little success. The Japanese economy faces difficulties while the work culture remains extremely rigid. Expectations include long working hours and obedience to a strict hierarchy. Many young people report working up to 19 hours a day, depending on the company. The practice of lifetime employment is still common, with companies hiring only once a year and promoting only internal employees, making it difficult for workers to take breaks or get a second chance if they fail to enter the workforce on the first try. As a result, millions are stuck in this system, and the number is growing as more young people fail to succeed in this relentless environment and end up giving up. In addition to current economic and social challenges, Japan also faces the presence of one of the world's most famous and feared criminal organizations, the Yakuza. This well-structured criminal organization is composed of families and clans with their own codes of conduct and severe punishments, which have allowed their survival over the decades. The earliest mentions of the Yakuza date back to the samurai era in Japan. In the 17th century, individuals known as bakuto emerged, who were dedicated to gambling and lived on the fringes of the law. These individuals began to organize into groups called Ninkyo Dantai, driven by a code of honor similar to that of samurais. Over time, these groups came to be known as the Yakuza. Over the years, the Yakuza grew in influence and power through activities such as extortion, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and even murder. Today, although the Yakuza still exists, its power and influence have significantly diminished. This is due to a number of factors, including increased government pressure, stricter laws, and the modernization of Japanese society. Many of their businesses, both legitimate and illegitimate, have been destroyed, and many leaders have been arrested. However, the Yakuza is still present in some parts of Japanese society, especially in more traditional neighborhoods. The organization has adapted to modern times, getting involved in activities like real estate, entertainment markets, and legalized gambling. Despite the changes, the code of honor and loyalty to family and clan remain central aspects of the Yakuza's identity. If you travel to Japan, you don't need to worry about crimes from this criminal organization, as they currently avoid trouble with ordinary citizens and the police. Nowadays, they operate more discreetly in real estate, businesses, and nightclubs, often offering services involving prostitution, a problem that moves a lot of money in the shady side of the Japanese economy. The main victims of this black market are easily seen on the streets of Japan, where many young women work handing out flyers, signs, and pamphlets to attract customers to various establishments, such as cafes, restaurants, and other businesses. This marketing strategy aims to increase clientele and generate more revenue for the owners of these establishments. So far, there's nothing wrong, and all of this is completely legal. However, this is where the illegal services of the Yakuza come into play, as there are night restaurants, entertainment houses, and bars involved in illicit activities, especially in the sale of sexual services. Foreigners, known as gaijins, are often the main victims of these scams. When walking the streets, it's important to be aware of approaches. There are various types of scams, such as the donation scam, where people ask for money for a specific cause. There are also gaijin hunters, Japanese women who take advantage of wealthy foreigners, going out with them to dates, bars, and parties, while financially exploiting them to the maximum, receiving expensive gifts and purchases. After getting what they want, they disappear. Another common scam occurs in places that offer cheap drinks. But when it's time to pay the bill, the prices are ridiculously inflated, and you're left with no way out. In these places, some employees are paid to pay attention to customers and encourage them to drink a lot. When it's time to pay the exorbitant bill, the owners may even resort to violence if you don't pay the extortionate amounts. These are just some of the most well-known scams reported by foreigners in Japan. Undoubtedly, many of these scams are related to the Yakuza, even if indirectly. The most lucrative illegal work for the Yakuza is prostitution. The red light district in Japan is one of the most well-known places to offer this type of service, often disguised as massage parlors and restaurants. Many of the women involved are not Japanese, but rather brought from poorer countries in Southeast Asia, victims of human trafficking and false promises of better jobs. It's important to note that the Yakuza isn't the only one responsible for the sale of illegal services related to prostitution. Situations vary, from women brought from nearby and poor countries to students who prostitute themselves to pay for college. Therefore, we can see that Japan, despite being portrayed as an ideal country in headlines, faces many problems, just like other countries around the world. Now, share in the comments any other problems and scams you know related to Japan that we haven't mentioned in this video.